Well, good morning, and thanks everybody for coming. We have a quorum present. So, Rick Allen, would you open us with a prayer, please?
All right, if we can get settled down, we'll go to the Father in prayer here. Well, Father, we are grateful for this new day, this beautiful day you've given us. Let us have gratitude for it, for the breath we take, and for what you have so graciously given us. Thank you for agriculture, for the ability to produce our food. We ask you to be with our farmers and their families as we continue to feed those folks who are in need and help our neighbors. Lord, thank you for our time together here this morning. Give us wisdom and encouragement, and we thank you for it. In His name we pray. Amen.
All right, thank you, Rick. Good morning. The committee is examining H.R. 2988, the Commodity End User Relief Act. The bill before us represents the bipartisan work of dozens of members of this committee over the past 3 years to address the challenges and uncertainties that end users are facing in derivatives markets. I'd like to start by thanking the leadership of the Commodity Exchange, Energy, and Credit Subcommittee, Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Scott. Following the full committee's hearing with CFTC Commissioner Chairman Massad in February, they've led the committee's work on this issue. Over the past 2 months, they've held 3 separate hearings to gather testimony from the end-user community, market service providers, and the rank-and-file commissioners. What the subcommittee heard has been a consistent call to action by other market participants struggling to comply with rules that are needlessly burdensome and a law that is at times unclear. Like last year, the committee will consider a collection of narrowly targeted changes in the Commodity Exchange Act to provide the right relief to the right people. The reforms in this bill fall into 3 broad categories. First, the legislation protects customer margin funds by codifying critical changes made in the wake of the collapse of the bankruptcies of MF Global and Paragon Financial. In both these financial disasters, customer margin funds were stolen and thousands of Americans were left on the hook. Today's legislation cements the important reforms made over the last 2 years into law. Second, this legislation makes meaningful reforms to the operations of the Commission that improve the deliberative process at the agency. It will ensure that rank-and-file commissioners have the timely information they need to fulfill their duties to the public. It also requires that the Commission put in place a robust system of cost-benefit analysis to get future rulemakings right the first time and avoid the endless supply of reproposing and delaying unworkable rules. Third, the bill fixes real problems for end users who rely on derivatives markets to manage their risks. New rules for record-keeping, registration, definitions, and others may have seemed good in theory but at the Commission, but they present incredible challenges to established business practices and real costs to end users required to comply. When it is more costly for those who need these markets to use them, it discourages exactly the kind of prudent risk management activities Congress intended to protect with the end user exemption in Dodd-Frank. As the Commission has worked through its complicated and difficult task of implementing the Dodd-Frank Act, it has made choices at every step of the process about how best to interpret the instructions Congress provided. It is no surprise to me that the Commission has not always interpreted the law as Congress intended. That's the nature of creating laws through regulation. But for the past 3 years, the committee has debated the wisdom of the Commission's approach to these issues, and time again, we've come to the conclusion that the burdens these rules place on our constituents are not appropriate to the regulatory gain established. Over the past 2 Congresses, we've passed over a dozen bipartisan bills to address our concerns about these specific issues. It's our job here in this committee to balance these trade-offs, and that's what we'll accomplish with today's legislation. Today, the committee will reaffirm our commitment to protecting American farmers, ranchers, manufacturers, and other businesses from being saddled with costly new burdens stemming from policies meant to protect them in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. But we will do so while being fully supportive of underlying goals of Title VII to bring clearing, reporting, and electronic execution requirements to swaps transactions. I'm pleased that the committee will again act in a bipartisan matter. Over the past 2 Congresses, I've enjoyed working with Ranking Member Scott on these issues and have always respected his keen insight into these markets. I'm happy the committee is again able to introduce a bill that has earned his support. I'd like to close again by thanking him, Chairman Scott, and all the other members of the subcommittee for the hard work they've done over the past few months. I was able to sit in on several of their hearings, and I am proud of the engagement and preparedness of all of my colleagues that they showed with these complicated issues. I look forward to the upcoming amendment debate and urge my colleagues to support the Commodity End User Relief Act. With that, I'll turn to the Ranking Member Mr. Peterson for any comments that he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I want to thank you and your staff for your efforts on this bill. And I hope that we can continue this collegial process even as we find ourselves on different sides. And while I co-sponsored H.R. 4413 last Congress, I am unable to support this bill because the facts on the ground, particularly at the Commission, have changed. I don't believe we need all these extra provisions, and I think we need just a simple reauthorization. I am concerned that Title II's requirements would actually make it more difficult for the Commission to function and only slow down the process of providing regulatory relief to market participants. I'm encouraged by Chairman Massad's negotiations with foreign regulators to achieve a cross-border regulatory regime. Unfortunately, the cross-border section in this bill presents a very real danger of cutting the chairman off at the knees by requiring rulemaking promising substituted compliance to foreign companies in the midst of these ongoing negotiations. So because of our work on Title VII of Dodd-Frank, the derivatives markets as a whole are much safer now than they once were. The commissions and the markets they regulate need our support. Unfortunately, I think that in some areas this bill moves us in the wrong direction, and in addition to that, we have amendments that are being offered by both sides of the aisle that I think also are unnecessary and are going to cause more trouble than they solve. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ranking Member Austin Scott, any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Peterson, and my colleague from Georgia, Mr. David Scott. I want to start by thanking all of you. We've had a constructive tone in our committee. It's because of diligent work and constructive hearing process that we're able to produce the bill that we have before us today. Over the course of this year, the Commodity Exchanges, Energy, and Credit Subcommittee has held three very productive hearings built upon work done on this reauthorization in the last Congress. We had many hours of testimony. We heard diverse perspectives on the issues from the Commission, from market participants, from end users that were instrumental in helping us draft what would become the Commodity End User Relief Act. The farmers, the ranchers, the utilities, the manufacturers, and the other end users depend on markets to manage risk and thereby keep consumer costs low. That benefits all of us. Throughout this process, our goal was to see where our actions could clarify congressional intent, minimize regulatory burdens, and most importantly, preserve the ability for these necessary risk management markets to serve those who need them. With this bill, I believe we met those objectives of ensuring that our regulatory framework protects the integrity of our markets, but also does not limit the ability of end users to access these tools to conduct their business. As I close, I want to again thank Ranking Member Scott for his work alongside me as we've examined these issues. It's great to serve with a fellow Georgian. I'm proud that our subcommittee was able to work in such a bipartisan manner. And I do want to extend one final thank you to the members of the committee and my personal office staff. We could have accomplished nothing throughout this year without their tireless work. So thank you for your efforts. And with that, I urge my colleagues to support the Commodity End Users Relief Act.
Gentleman yields back. David Scott.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, it's been a pleasure working with my fellow Georgian, whom I affectionately refer to as my cousin Austin Scott from Georgia. He's a good man. Certainly enjoyed working with the committee on this. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, we must make sure that our great nation has the strongest, fairest regulatory framework for effective enforcement of commodity trading rules and regulations for this long overdue reauthorization of the CFTC. It's been 2 years in the making, 2 years of uncertainty. It is time for this committee to move and lead, as we should be doing, as the world's leading, most powerful economic system. We must provide the certainty that is required for the CFTC to do its work, and most importantly, we must provide relief that is critical for our end users. Secondly, we must clear up these cross-border guidance and harmonization issues, especially with the EU and its discriminatory practices against our U.S. companies. Through our subcommittee, Chairman Scott and myself, we have met with and consistently heard from our end users, from our CFTC commissioners, from our market participants regarding the dire need for reauthorization. And all of us agree that there is absolutely no reason as to why our end users are being forced to comply with registration and reporting requirements that we require of our larger financial institutions. The end users did not cause the financial meltdown. We must treat them fairly, and that is the reason why we make this, in addition to being the CFTC reauthorization bill, it is the end user relief bill, much needed. Now, I'd like to just also address the fact that we have to do this in a way that we make sure that our end users are able to hedge their risk. And in order to do all of this in an effective way, I believe we must include this cost-benefit analysis. Now, there have been some concerns. Will this lead to more litigation? Well, we have made sure that we would not do that, because this is why we don't mandate cost-benefit. We are simply asking the CFTC to consider, to assess cost-benefit. Would that not make sense to know what it would cost and what the benefits are? If we were to take a trip to any part of this country, before we take that trip, we sit down and say, what are the costs? What are the benefits? When we're also saying that we do not require that these benefits outweigh the costs before the CFT can go ahead with their rules or with their change. We're simply making that assessment. We are simply giving the CFTC the option to suspend a substitute of compliance if foreign entities deny the same status for the United States interests. This is harmonization, folks, and we need that, especially when it comes to the EU. Why would we want to continue to negotiate with foreign entities in good faith when they are not required to negotiate with us in good faith? Chairman Mossad has indeed been a leader in these negotiations. So let's give the Chairman Mossad the strength that is required and pass this CFTC regulation, which is indeed 2 years overdue. Our industries have been in limbo for 2 years. Finally, we must provide an understanding that the world's 8 largest markets will be considered comparable with U.S. swap requirements unless the CFTC, in this same form from last year, rules that they do not have a similar robust regime as ours. This is very critical. And Mr. Chairman, may I make one final point? We don't have time because many of our companies, particularly our clearinghouses, are being treated very shabbily by the EU. And we have a June 15th deadline before our clearinghouses will be placed at an amazing disadvantage. And so we definitely need to move this bill and get this reauthorization. And I urge my colleagues to join us in voting for it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, David. Appreciate that. Before we move on, I also want to thank Paul Balzano, Caleb Crosswhite, and Kevin Webb for their hard work on this, and Jackie Barber and her team for getting this somewhere. So The chair requests that other members submit their opening statements for the record so the committee may begin consideration of the bill before us. The bill H.R. 2289 is now before the committee for consideration, and without objection, the first reading of the bill will be waived, and the bill will be open to amendment by title. The bill is now open for amendment. I understand, Mr. Peterson, that you have an amendment. You want to offer?
Chairman, I do have an amendment to be distributed.
All right, recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes. Let's pass out the amendment first.
You want me to talk while they're doing it? Or you want me to talk while they're doing it?
Let's keep partially do it. Mr. Peterson is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment does away with a lot of what I consider unnecessary and extraneous items that are included in the underlying bill. And this amendment takes us closer to a clean reauthorization, which gives the commissions the tools and flexibility that they say they need and want to do their job. There's no reason for us to change the internal operations of the commission as the underlying bill intends. You know, there might have been a reason that we had some problems with the previous commission, and really some of those problems are being relitigated in this bill that I think are unnecessary. So, you know, I just think that adding those provisions is going to make it more problematic for the commission to be able to do their work. Amendment also does away with the underlying bill's cross-border provisions, which would, as I said earlier, only undercut the current negotiations with foreign regulators. And there's been some delays on the other side, but they're making good progress. And in most areas, except for one where they've delayed the rules, I think they're pretty close to getting those worked out. And I think the provisions in the bill are actually going to make it more unlikely that they get this done instead of more likely that they get it done. So the commission, I think, is on track. The new folks that are there are working together. This amendment will let them complete their work without unnecessary interference from Congress, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Recognize, bless you. Recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'm going to oppose the gentleman's amendment. The cost-benefit analysis is generally the same as it was in the bill that he supported last year. We did add one nugget that one of the things that they would like for the agency to consider is the internal costs of implementing particular rules and the versus an option of a rule. So it does strengthen that. It does require that. With respect to the comments about previous leadership of the agency driving some of the changes from last year, we did take a look at that and took out some of the things that were in there that were driven by the previous chairman. So we have given consideration to that. So I'm going to oppose the amendment and would urge my colleagues to oppose it as well. The underlying bill, as presented, makes meaningful choices or changes at the agency, along with the other things that were included. So with that, I yield back. Any other member wish to be heard on the gentleman's amendment? Mr. Scott, recognized for 5 minutes.
I simply want to state why I am supporting this amendment. As the chairman has mentioned, I have toiled in the vineyards of the Derivative Subcommittee for all these years, once as chairman and also as ranking member. I just want to clear the air on what the cost-benefit analysis. I've worked with the chairman on this, and I had and shared some of the concerns that our ranking member shared with this, and in response to the ranking member, whom I have great respect for, has some very legitimate concerns here. And I went to work on this to try to address the concerns of the ranking members. I'd like to take just a couple of moments to share. First of all, nowhere in the bill does it mandate that the benefits must outweigh the costs. The text of the bill simply directs the Commission to evaluate considerations of protecting of market participants and the public. The bill simply directs the Commission to consider the efficiency, competitiveness, and financial integrity of futures and swaps market, and directs the Commission to evaluate whether proposed regulations or order is inconsistent, incompatible, or duplicative of federal regulations. We know that resources are tight with the Commission. It helps us for the Commission to do the cost-benefit of analysis so that they know what are these. Would it require additional resources? So this, I think, helps the Commission. And finally, the bill does mandate that the Commission evaluate the costs to the Commission of implementing the proposed regulation of order. This point is to figure out which process is least burdensome to the Commission. And finally, while it is a fact that the CFTC has a cost-benefit analysis statute, it does already, but it does not clarify who actually does the cost-benefit. For a while, lawyers were conducting the cost-benefit as opposed to economists. Wouldn't it make more sense for an economist to do a cost-benefit analysis on what are basically economic issues? And so in conclusion, nowhere in this bill does it mandate the Commission to ensure that the benefits outweigh the costs. It simply directs the Commission to evaluate common sense practices and regarding regulations. So I just want to make sure that we heard the concerns of the ranking member, and we respect those, and he is right, and we have addressed those, and I just want to make that clear, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Jimmy goes back. Does anyone else want to be heard of the amendment? Ms. Delbini, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to yield to the ranking member.
Thanks, gentlelady. I just want to clarify, if the only change would have been the cost-benefit analysis, even though I think it's misguided, I would have supported the bill. I did last time. And the actual addition was not a problem, it making it that much worse than it was. So that wasn't the issue. The issue is this stuff that was brought in, which I really believe is going to muck up things at the Commission. And I think if a Republican is elected president, that Republican chairman is not going to be happy that he's got these provisions in there either. So that is one of the things. The other thing is that this cross-border stuff is, frankly, going to, I think, cause a problem. And so these are the, and plus there's these amendments, I guess we got 10 amendments, which I think are going to further screw up this bill, from both sides of the aisle, that are probably going to get adopted. So at the end of the day, I don't think any of this stuff is going to survive the process, so I'm not going to get too strung out about it, but it's not because of the cost-benefit analysis that I'm changing my position. It's these other provisions. Yield back.
I yield back.
The lady yields back. If no one wants to be heard, I'll call the vote on the gentleman's amendment from Minnesota. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say nay. Nay. Being the chair, the nays have it. The amendment is not adopted. Are there other amendments to Title I? Mr. Lucas, do you have an amendment? All right, sorry. Any other amendments to Title I? Seeing none, let's move to Title II. Any amendments to Title II? Mr. Lucas.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to this.
Pass out the amendment, please.
Number 4.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to offer amendment number 4, which is also co-sponsored by Mr. Nagelbauer of Texas and Mr. Rouser of North Carolina. Mr. Chairman, the amendment I'm offering today is needed to make sure that CFTC establishes appropriate safeguards to ensure the security of highly sensitive and proprietary information that firms regulated by the CFTC are required to provide to the agency as a part of their reporting obligations. In the wake of the financial crisis and the passage of Dodd-Frank, the CFTC implemented rules requiring firms to report highly sensitive data and information to the agency. Regulated firms have complied with those requirements in good faith, with the understanding that that information will be subject to the highest level of protection available. The reporting requirements are intended to protect the integrity of markets and investors. If this information is not properly safeguarded, should that information be compromised as a result of an intentional leak or some other breach of the integrity of our markets, farmers, ranchers, end users that rely on them would be at risk. My amendment would address this concern and this potential threat by requiring CFTC to put in place simple procedures to ensure the safeguarding of confidential data and highly sensitive information they receive and transmit. It's a sensible measure that effectively harmonizes CFTC safeguards with those that currently exist at other agencies that collect and handle sensitive information, including the SEC. Importantly, this amendment imposes no restrictions on Congress or this committee's ability to perform its important oversight of the agency, commodity markets, and those who participate in those markets. In addition, I look forward to working with the chairman and fellow committee members to ensure that our committee also has appropriate procedures in place for maintaining the confidentiality of any proprietary information that we as a committee obtain. Mr. Chairman, this language enjoyed bipartisan support in the last Congress, and I believe it remains a bipartisan issue. I urge my colleagues to support this simple but yet very needed amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair intends to support the gentleman's amendment. Are there other folks who wish to be heard on the gentleman's amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to speak in favor of this amendment, and I want to thank Mr. Lucas for introducing it. And just so folks on our side of the aisle understand, I think this is a good bipartisan contribution, and I think it's important that we protect proprietary and confidential information, and I believe the Commission can agree with us on this point. And so I want to thank the gentleman for his amendment and offer my support.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back. Others who want to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, call for the question. All those in favor of the gentleman from Oklahoma's amendment say aye. Aye. All opposed say nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there further amendments to Title 2?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
All right. Will the pass out the Delbini amendment number 3? Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank the chairman and ranking members and all the staff for their work on this very important issue. During last Congress's consideration of the Customer Protection and End User Relief Act, this identical amendment passed by voice vote, and thanks to both Congressman Gibson and Vargas for co-sponsoring that amendment. It was the only bipartisan amendment we considered. This amendment simply states that a court shall affirm that the CFTC's assessment of the costs and benefits of a rule. This would have the practical impact of limiting the ability of individuals and firms to challenge the CFTC in court in an attempt to stop a rule from being implemented based on the cost-benefit analysis. The amendment provides for an exception in the case of an abuse of discretion by the Commission. If no such abuse occurs, a court must uphold the CFTC's assessment. At a time when the CFTC is still implementing a litany of critical rules, including a number of rules required by Dodd-Frank, we should not be inhibiting the CFTC's progress and adding to their workload, especially when the agency is already struggling with insufficient resources for the task at hand. To be clear, the CFTC is already required to consider the costs and benefits of its actions and regulations. It just does not provide a formal analysis of the costs and benefits. If we're going to mandate that the CFTC provide a formal cost-benefit analysis when developing regulations, which can be incredibly time-consuming and burdensome, we should trust their analysis and not let rules get tied up in costly and time-consuming litigation. We should defer to the experts here. Why go through a rigorous process like a cost-benefit analysis and expend time and resources if the end result can just be derailed by a lawsuit filed at the 11th hour? I firmly believe this is a small but important improvement to the bill, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Ladies are back. Mr. Scott, David,
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I support the Dalbany amendment. It is a very good amendment. She's worked on it. It passed on the floor in the last session, and certainly addresses our point in the avoidance of unnecessary lawsuits. I think it adds clarity, transparency, and a good guidance for the CFTC, and I recommend passage of this amendment. Thank you.
Jim yields back. The chair intends to support the amendment. Are there others who want to be heard on the gentlelady from Washington's amendment? Seeing none, the questions on the amendment from the gentlelady from Washington. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Mr. Goodlatte, you're recognized for an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I commend you for the Commodity End User Relief Act of 2015 before us today to foster a transparent, balanced, and functional marketplace. And I also appreciate the attention that you and Commodity Exchanges Subcommittee Chairman Austin Scott, as well as others on the committee, have paid to relating to the amendment that I am offering to seek to ensure that markets operate in an orderly manner. So I have an amendment at the desk. I think they're distributing the amendment. Shall I proceed with my explanation?
Yes.
The amendment encourages the efforts of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to continue to review the relationship of long queues for the delivery of aluminum at warehouses to the pricing of aluminum and how those issues impact market integrity and market participants. This uncertainty in the market means higher prices for families and businesses across America. The amendment seeks to prevent the unreasonable delay of delivery of such commodities, which can cost end-user companies with increased storage fees, potentially higher prices due to supply and demand implications, and result in uneconomic commodity prices. The persistence of long, disruptive market queues for the delivery of aluminum at warehouses in this country licensed overseas has attracted considerable concern for end users and consumers of products which many Americans utilize on a daily basis. Even the Senate Select Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations issued a bipartisan report last year that raised significant concerns regarding aluminum market price practices. Chairman Massad testified before this committee on February 12, quote, "An issue of concern we are focused on pertains to the long queues for the delivery of aluminum at warehouses in this country licensed by the London Metal Exchange. The relationship of those queues to the pricing and delivery of aluminum and how these issues impact market integrity and market participants. Toward that end, I commend the CFTC's recent oversight actions, as the CFTC noted that while progress has been made, the results attained to date indicate that more progress is needed. Specifically, my amendment directs the Commodity Futures Trading Commission within 90 days of enactment to report to Congress regarding the ongoing review of Foreign Board of Trade applications for metals exchanges and the status of its negotiations with foreign regulators regarding aluminum warehousing. Such status report shall inform the CFTC in determining Foreign Boards of Trade status for metals exchange applications, and such metals exchange Foreign Board of Trade determination shall be made no later than September 30 of next year. The amendment carries endorsements from the American Beverage Association, the Aluminum Users Group, and many others, and I urge its adoption in
to promote efficiency, competition, and economic growth in the marketplace. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Are there others who want to be heard on the gentleman's amendment? Chair intends to support it. Yes, Mr. Newhouse for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for yielding. I'd like to add my support to this amendment for its intention to resolve serious distortions currently present in our nation's aluminum market. For quite some time, end users who rely on aluminum for building cars, aircraft, canning, and other purposes have been unable to access the aluminum they purchased in a timely fashion. Delivery times have taken months, sometimes years, when standard delivery times for other commodities take mere days. The resulting aluminum shortage has led to significant distortions in aluminum prices, driving up costs for Americans who purchase these products. This amendment would give the CFTC the tools needed to hold foreign exchanges accountable and ensure fair, timely delivery to the end users. And I thank Chairman Goodlatte for his hard work on this issue, and I look forward to supporting the amendment. And I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Are there others who want to be heard on this amendment? Ms. Walorski from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the intent of the amendment, and I'm voting no, but I think that we just need to be really sure. I think there needs to be very good due diligence on our side, and as the committee, that there is complete fairness and transparency and openness when we talk about studies and we talk about reviews. I just think that there just needs to be a great amount of due diligence of the folks that are involved in this review. So I would appreciate that, and I'm voting no. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Others who want to be heard? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment from the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Any other amendments on Title II? All right, we'll now move to Title III. Amendments on Title III. Mr. Davis from Illinois.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Please pass out the amendment, and you'll be recognized in just a second. Chairman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you for your leadership, and also to Ranking Member Scott, Ranking Member Peterson. My amendment would help reduce a regulatory burden and duplicative registration requirements that are affecting savers, investors, and retirees. Registered investment companies such as mutual funds and other investment companies they're the preferred investment vehicles for millions of Americans who are looking to buy a home, invest for college, or plan for financial security in retirement. Currently, these investment companies are all registered with and regulated by the SEC, and they must comply with an extensive set of regulations, including the required oversight of their derivatives holdings. In 2012, the CFTC drastically broadened the reach of its oversight as it relates to registered funds, a change that was not required by Dodd-Frank. As a result of this change to CFTC Rule 4.5, no more than 70 fund companies that manage over 5,000 mutual funds have had to register with the CFTC as commodity pool operators. Registered funds are already heavily regulated by the SEC and are among the most highly regulated financial products in the United States. By making an appropriate change to the CFTC's reach, this amendment would reduce unnecessary and duplicative costs and regulations created by the CFTC in a manner that would not undermine investor protection. At a time when so many are approaching retirement, this amendment will help keep regulatory costs down while ultimately protecting consumers' ability to save. An identical amendment passed with strong bipartisan support on the floor during the House's consideration of CFTC reauthorization last year, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes on its adoption.
Gentleman yields back. Are there others who want to be heard on the gentleman's amendment? Seeing none, then the question is on the amendment for the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Are there further amendments on title? Ms. Custer is recognized for 5 minutes. Or Ms. Custer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
All right, if the gentlelady will hold for a second, we'll get that passed out. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to also thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and both sides of the aisle, Representative Beneček, Ashford, and Molinar, for co-sponsoring this amendment. From New Hampshire to Nebraska to Michigan and throughout our country, nonprofit organizations are educating our children, feeding the hungry, and bringing people together for worship and public service. And while their missions may be religious, charitable, or educational in nature, many of these institutions face uncertainty as to whether they are required to register with the Commodities Futures Trading Commission as commodity pool operators. This is a serious concern for a wide variety of nonprofits, including churches, civic organizations, and universities such as Dartmouth College in my congressional district. Universities, for example, routinely manage endowment funds alongside funds dedicated for athletics, scholarships, and other purposes. In order to manage risks, swaps are used to protect these funds from fluctuations in interest rates and other market conditions. For these reasons, questions have been raised as to whether colleges and other nonprofits are required to register with the CFTC as commodity pool operators or commodity trading advisors. Such designations could result in significant costs and complications, needlessly diverting resources from education, philanthropy, and other worthy causes. These nonprofit organizations are already exempt from SEC registration requirements. This amendment would simply grant these same nonprofits an exemption from CFTC registration requirements. I fully support preserving CFTC authority to appropriately monitor and regulate financial markets, but clearly regulators must draw a distinction between commercial enterprises and the churches, schools, and charities serving communities across our nation. This bipartisan amendment has the support of the National Association of College and University Business Officers, as well as a number of religious coalitions. And I'm proud to have worked on this amendment across the aisle with Republicans and Democrats in the bipartisan tradition of this committee. With that said, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to my colleague and co-sponsor, with whom I also serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee, Mr. Beneček.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Peterson, thanks for the opportunity to offer this amendment today. I know I'll be brief because we got a lot of stuff to do, but this amendment that I've worked with Representative Custer, Mr. Molinar, and Mr. Ashford would provide certainty for the churches, universities, and other charitable organizations across the country. Put simply, this amendment would ensure that charitable organizations are not needlessly required to register as commodity pool operators or commodity trading advisors. Some larger charities, like churches and universities, can have complex investments and endowments which have traditionally been exempt from SEC registration. This amendment would provide a parallel rule in the Commodity Exchange Act. We all have a number of charitable organizations in our districts, like the Community Foundation of the Upper Peninsula, that work to serve those in need in local communities. I urge you to keep their good works in mind and support this bipartisan amendment today. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Beneček, for partnering with me on this effort. Anyone else? With that, I urge adoption of the amendment, and thank you for your consideration. I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there others who want to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, the questions on the amendment from the lady from New Hampshire. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Depending on the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Mr. Eimer for an amendment, Title 3.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do. I have an amendment at the desk.
Pass out the amendment, please. And it's Emmer, not Eimer. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the ranking member. This is an amendment to the Commodity Exchange Act clarifying that the CFTC's decisions to exempt small banks and savings association from classification as a financial entity will include the holding companies of those associations. The small holding company clearing issue has become an issue because small holding companies were not included as an exemption in Dodd-Frank, even though they should have been.
Essentially, this was overlooked because it was assumed that holding companies were the same as deposit institutions, which is not the case. This amendment is a technical fix for small bank holding companies and swaps reporting. Essentially, banks under $10 billion in assets are exempt from the requirement to clear derivatives, but holding companies to banks are not exempt. However, the holding companies are often where these swaps transactions are conducted to manage interest rate risk for the bank. This amendment extends clearing relief to holding companies, enabling banks to cost-effectively manage their risks, and I ask for support.
Chairman yields back. Are there others who want to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, then the questions on the amendment for Mr. Eimer from Minnesota. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. There are further, Mr. Scott, for an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment passed out. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A swap execution facility, commonly referred to as a CEF in our discussion, there were some requirements on them where they were actually asked to monitor and given responsibility to monitor over trading and swaps in facilities outside of their own. This narrows their responsibility to only in its own facility would they be required to monitor those swaps. It also replaces the requirement that a CEF holds funds to cover its operating costs for 1 year with the requirement that it hold funds to conduct an orderly wind down of operations if something should happen to the CEF. It further modifies the duties of the CEF Chief Compliance Officer and the procedures for the CEF annual reports to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission.
Gentleman yields back. Are there others who want to be heard on this?
Mr. Chairman.
Peterson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As was said, this section amends the core principles of the swap execution facilities and narrows the monitoring responsibilities of those facilities, requires the CEFs to hold funds to conduct an orderly wind down of operations rather than covering its operating costs for the year, as they currently do, collapses some of the duties of a CEF's compliance officer, chief compliance officer, and allows CEFs a wide discretion to establish their own surveillance, market monitoring, and audit trails. So some folks, including myself, have concerns with the practical implications of these institutions, but also regarding the impact that this would have on pre-trade price transparency by giving a big break to the voice brokers. So I would encourage opposition to the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Would you get somebody to recognize you? You've already had your 5 minutes. Mr. Crawford.
Yield my time to Mr. Scott.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes. Yielded to Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These CEFs would still be subject to CFTC rules and regulations and approval of their plan by the CFTC on the wind down. It's simply that some of the smaller CEFs, it simply wouldn't take 12 full months to wind them down, and so it's a burden in actually getting additional competition into the market by requiring them to keep that much cash on hand. So the intent here is to bring more competition into the market where possible, and again, it still has to be, their plan still has to be approved by the CFTC.
Gentleman yields back. Excuse me, gentleman yields back.
Yield back.
All right. Others who want to be heard on the amendment? Chair intends to support the amendment. The question is on the amendment for the gentleman from Georgia. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Mr. Lucas for an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe I have amendment number 8 at the desk.
Pass out number 8. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased today to introduce this, what I believe is a straightforward and an important amendment with my colleague, Mr. Allen of Georgia. This amendment amends the Commodities Exchange Act to clarify that advances made to financial institutions by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board system are identified banking products, regulated by the Federal Housing Finance Administration, and not derivatives subject to regulation by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. The CFTC currently recognizes Federal Home Loan Bank advances to their members as banking products. The amendment simply seeks to clarify this treatment. These amendments are not risky derivatives, were never intended to be regulated as such. The Federal Home Loan Bank system is an important source of financing for our local community financial institutions, and the products they provide should not be subjected to additional unnecessary regulation by the CFTC. Pretty straightforward, Mr. Chairman. Now you go back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there others who want to be heard?
Sure,
Mr. Peterson
Chairman.
for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I don't oppose the idea of exempting these transactions, between the Federal Home Loan Banks and the housing finance agencies, but I have some concerns about the way the amendment is drafted. As it reads, it seems to me it's too broad to reach the objective, and this definition of appropriate federal banking agency is a term that occurs throughout the CEA, but the text of this amendment does not specifically address the technical concern identified in the description. And so I think the practical extent of the amendment appears overbroad to achieve its objective, and I'm not opposed to what you're trying to do. I just think this could be better refined.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
I thank the ranking member, and while I believe that the language does what it's intended to do, I respect his opinions. I would ask that we continue to adopt the amendment, but I would say to the ranking member I'd be happy to work with him as this proceeds to get to a definition that meets the goal and the legal standard that would reflect it.
I thank the gentleman, and I take him up on his offer, and I'll support the amendment.
Thank you, sir. Now yield back to the gentleman.
Chair intends to support the amendment. Are there others who want to be heard of the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment for the gentleman from Oklahoma. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Which means the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Mr. Boss, recognized for an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Please pass it out.
I'm with you.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would help the chairman of the CFTC put U.S. exchanges and clearinghouses on equal footing with their foreign peers. The amendment adds a provision to provide the chairman the authority to withhold any exemptions from foreign jurisdictions that do not recognize U.S. regulations are equal or adequate enough to be considered as a substitute for the foreign jurisdiction regulations. I think all the members would agree that we need to allow for our market participants to be treated fairly. Nothing in my amendment or the section of the bill it amends requires the chairman to take action. It only changes and allows the tools that they need to and have at their disposal to see parity for U.S. markets and the market participants. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to bring this amendment forward, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair intends to support the amendment. Are there others who want to be heard of the amendment? Mr. Scott from Georgia. Mr. David Scott from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to support this amendment. Ladies and gentlemen, in my opening statement, I spoke to a need for our clearinghouses, our business community in this country to have equal equivalency that is shared, particularly in terms of the European Union. The European Union, after more than 2 years of negotiation and delay, the EU still has refused to grant U.S. equivalency. Now, by contrast, the European Commission recently granted equivalent status to several jurisdictions in Asia, including Singapore, which has the same margin regime as the United States. and the European Commission's discriminatory approach to U.S. access to EU markets is creating significant competitive disadvantages for U.S. markets and the participants that use those markets. Without EU recognition or equivalence, U.S. clearinghouses will not be able to clear EU-mandated derivatives. As market participants need to prepare for the impending effectiveness of Europe's swaps clearing mandates by year-end already, we are seeing European clearing members and other market participants taking steps to consider alternatives to United States exchanges and clearinghouses. This is causing disruptions to U.S. futures markets because without equivalence, the cost of clearing futures on U.S. markets will increase significantly on June 15th, 1 month from today. This is why this amendment is important, and I think and I hope it will send a very clarion message to our European friends to treat our United States companies with the same respect that we treat our European friends.
Jim is back. Others who want to be heard on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Who's speaking? Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Maloney. Mr. Chairman.
That's for 5 minutes. Mueller, yes, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. I just want to align myself with the comments of my colleague from Georgia. It's absolutely important that we strengthen the hand of our U.S. regulators vis-a-vis the European regulators, and it's outrageous that we have not been accorded the equivalency that they've shown others, and I just support this fully. Thank you.
Jim is back. Are there others who want to be heard? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment by the gentleman from Illinois. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say nay. The chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there further amendments for the bill before us? Seeing none, then the chair recognizes Mr. David Scott for an amendment, for the motion.
Thought we had another amendment there. But, Mr. Chairman, I move that the bill H.R. 2289 as amended be reported favorably to the House with the recommendations that it do pass.
All right. This is a debatable motion. Any of those who care to be heard on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question then. The question is on the motion by the gentleman from Georgia. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say nay. Being the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is adopted. Does any member wish to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views on H.R. 2289? If so, please have them submitted to the council's office, room 1407, by noon on May 18th, 2015. Without objection, the usual instructions are given to staff that consist of making such technical, clarifying, and conforming changes as are appropriate without changing the substance of the legislation. Seeing no other business, the meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everybody, for your quick work this morning.